Good morning, everybody. Buenos dias, and welcome to the Inter-American Dialogue. Thank you very much for joining us. We're very pleased to continue our partnership and cooperation with the International Crisis Group in this event, a prestigious independent organization based in Brussels that's focused on preventing crisis and peace building throughout the world. We're delighted to work with the ICG. In the past, we've worked with them on a number of other critical issues in the hemisphere, like the crisis in Venezuela, and also the criminality and violence in the Northern Triangle of Central America. Today's event coincides with the imminent release of the report that all of you have a copy of, called Building Peace in Mexico, Dilemmas Facing the López Obrador Government. The report is extremely timely, less than 2 months before López Obrador actually begins his presidency in Mexico, although sometimes it seems like he's already been there for 6 months or so. Like he's on his way out rather than he's on his way. But in any case, he faces a formidable agenda and many challenges. He is inheriting a country with a stagnant economy and massive corruption and violence, state collusion with organized crime. And there have been record number of homicides, I guess 2017, and 2018, this year, is likely to be the deadliest year yet in Mexico. The efforts by the two major parties that have been in office, the PAN party and the PRI governments, have failed to yield positive results and reverse this very troubling tendency. There are high expectations for AMLO's government after winning with a larger than expected margin on July 1st. He has talked about new proposals, including reversing the militarization of public security, drug legalization, amnesties, truth commissions, transitional justice, and other efforts at peace building. This morning, using the excellent report of the ICG as a point of departure, we're going to talk about these ideas, though they still remain a bit sketchy and details need to be fleshed out. So that should be a caveat for our discussion. There's still a lot we don't know. But I think we should begin the discussion and talk about whether these ideas make sense. Are they viable? Are they more likely to produce results, positive results in Mexico than other policies that have been tried in the past? What obstacles do they face in terms of being adopted and implemented in Mexico? To present the main points and conclusions of the report and address these questions, we're very fortunate to have with us Ivan Briscoe, who's the program director for Latin America and the Caribbean at the International Crisis Group, and also Falco Ernst, who is the senior analyst for Mexico at the ICG. Welcome to both of you. And to comment on the report and begin the discussion that will eventually involve all of you, we're really delighted this morning to have Maureen Meyer, who is a leading authority on Mexico's human rights and security situation and policies aimed to address those challenges. Maureen is the director for Mexico and migrant rights at the Washington office on Latin America. So thank you, Maureen. It's great to have you with us. So why don't I turn it over to Ivan to get us started, and then we'll hear from Falco and then Maureen. Ivan, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Michael. It's always a pleasure to come here at the Inter-American Dialogue, to be with such an informed group of people. We've spoken here a few times before, and it's invariably been an excellent debate at the end, and I hope this is no exception. I just want to start by putting things in, and our work on this issue, in a bit of context. It's quite extraordinary what we saw a few days ago in Brazil in terms of the first round in the elections in Brazil. You all know the results and how striking the differences in those results from the results in the elections in Mexico on the 1st of July, because the two biggest democracies in Latin America, these two countries, have been suffering a very similar series of problems. Just to put it in perspective, between the two of them in 2017, we're talking about a total of 85,000 murders. Very similar problems in terms of systemic corruption affecting the highest level of politics. Highly discredited ruling elites to such an extent that levels of trust in the governments in Brazil and Mexico tend to hover around, if not below, 10%. And there are certain analysts who would say that at the end of the day, what we are seeing in Mexico and Brazil are mirror images from the left and the right of similar responses. So in some ways, López Obrador in Mexico on the left and Bolsonaro on the right in Brazil are substantially the same, although from very different sides of the ideological spectrum. The argument would be in this respect that they have highly personalistic styles based heavily on their charisma, that they are both anti-elite populists, if you like, and that neither of them have anything like a coherent plan for government. I think the basis of our report, in fact, the reason we write the report is that we do not believe that is the case at all, that these are similarities in form, maybe, certain similarities in the sort of political style, but not similarities at all in substance. In fact, the substantive differences between López Obrador and Bolsonaro could not be greater. Only one of them, and I think we know which one, seeks to address the structural causes of violence in their country. The other one does not do so at all. One is seeking to break the cycles of violence in their country, and the other seems to be willing to exacerbate it. And only one of them is highly attuned to the long and deep effect on human rights and victims of violence in their country. López Obrador, in many ways, is a harbinger of hope for his people. And this is something we saw when I accompanied Falco in May for some of the research for this report. We had a somewhat extraordinary serendipitous incident in Tlalpan, outside Mexico City, where we bumped into Felipe Calderón in the Pontifical University of that town and had some words with him, and then walked 200 meters, and by sheer coincidence, López Obrador was holding a campaign rally in the very same town. So in the space of an hour or so, we saw the past of the Mexican presidency, Mexican power, and what was then to be its future. And the plaza was full. And these were not, I know campaign rallies across Latin America. I know when people have been paid and bussed in and given food to attend a rally. This was not the case in López Obrador's rally. This was genuine public support. And his main point, what he emphasized in the rally, and I think this is the essence of his appeal and also of the certain caveats and cautions which were going to be noticed, he emphasized, I am a stubborn man. I'm a career politician who never gives up, who stood in, now this was his third presidential candidacy, if I'm not mistaken, and has not given up. And I will fight corruption and insecurity in the same way that I have fought to be president of this country. As our report discusses, however, the goals he has set himself go far beyond a matter of personal resolve and charisma and determination. Deep structural issues await his attention and his objectives. Demilitarization, reforming the police, building peace, and punishing those who have violated human rights on a massive scale in recent years. And the question which has to an extent guided our research for the report is what the costs of this search for peace could be and what compromises might have to be made on the way. How is he going to achieve real institutional reform in the police and judiciary when this has been tried again and again over the last 12 years without any great success, in fact, often making the situation worse? How is he going to manage the spoilers, those who have vested interests in the status quo, including, of course, the armed forces who have been leading the fight against organized crime for the last decade? And perhaps on a more philosophical level, how can he negotiate the relative importance of addressing human rights violations in the past from preventing human rights violations in the future. Should he conduct a sustained campaign to bring redress for the crimes of the past, or adopt more of a blank slate, accept a blank slate, and start by instituting reforms which will not allow those abuses in the future? Not everything can be done in Mexico. We know, I think everybody, or most people in this room would accept, what Mexico should look like, ideally, how it should ideally deal with its insecurity problems. It should have the rule of law. It should have an independent judiciary. It should have an intelligence-led civilian policing force capable of dealing with its multiple phenomena of organized crime. But the reality is that will not be built in one term of a president, nor probably within the next decade. So the report is focusing instead on, in this very complex situation with these apparent trade-offs, what should be the concrete steps to be taken. And at that stage, I want to hand over to Falco, who's quite new in the post as analyst, as a great experience. He's done actually a doctorate on organized crime in Michoacan, and just so you know, to accompany this report, he's written a piece about his experience of getting to know and understand a killer, a paid killer, sicario, in Michoacan. So he's someone who actually knows what's going on from the very base. And so it's a great honor to be able to have him here to speak about this. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Ivan. Appreciate it. Thanks again also to Michael for hosting us, and Maureen for providing a comment so kindly, I hope kindly. We'll see after this. Now, as Ivan already mentioned, I mean, this is pretty much our pre-launch party of sorts. So the official report, I mean, we'll officially release it on Thursday, but you already have copies there. So, I mean, we're really happy about kind of comment about the discussion afterwards. Looking forward to that, and any kind of criticism you might have at this stage or anytime later on. I mean, very happy to engage in conversations, which I think are more necessary than ever these days in Mexico, because even 12 years into the so-called war on drugs, there's just so much we don't understand. And that was really the focus and sort of like the main paradox we focused on with this report, is that there's still a lot of blank spots, if it were, in our understanding, and thus there are blank spots in what should be a sound basis, sound intellectual basis, and sound analytical basis for construing sound policies. And we have that discussion now with the new government. There's a lot of promises, of course. I mean, promises that weren't realistic to begin with, if you want to put it that way, because, I mean, López Obrador promised that he would just sweep away war and introduce blooming landscapes, as it were, within 3 years. You know, so we all know that's a bit more complicated in the actual political and social process in Mexico. Now, for this report, we spent quite a bit of time giving it the direction it now took. Still a lot of space for discussion, as I mentioned. And for one thing, I think what also took us time and needs to take time is the fieldwork process, in a sense. So we were lucky enough to dig up interesting voices. You'll see in the report represented voices from active and past members of different so-called drug cartels, criminal organizations, including La Familia Michoacana and the Knights Templar organization, other splinter groups. And we represent those voices in parallel to voices of federal police, of local civilians, and of higher-ranking officers of the Mexican Navy, for instance. And I think this is kind of like speaks to the spirit of the work of Crisis Group, but also to the spirit of what we need right now is a more thorough understanding of the local conflict scenarios we're seeing, because that's still missing, because in part of the difficulties that we have been encountering in academia, also in non-governmental organizations and in general, to actually get close to the involved actors that ultimately can tell you everything about the contradictions behind the label of the war on drugs and the monolithic categories it peddles, including a sort of antagonistic opposition between El Narco on one side and the state on the other, as if we had a epic fight of good against evil, so to speak. Of course, on the local level, it's much more complicated than that. I believe that, well, the two blank spots that we are identifying that I think will decide over the fate and the success or the failure of any policy line that will ultimately be defined are, on one hand, recognizing the local complex realities that we're seeing on the ground. So we speak of a plethora of localized armed conflicts instead of one Mexican conflict or even such a thing as a war on drugs. And taking those into account and getting closer and understanding the motives of actors involved, understanding what actually drives dynamics of killing and what has been indeed accentuating the killing over the last years, as Michael already mentioned, is absolutely key to then construe fine-tuned policy solutions that could hopefully wield some results in the medium and long terms. The other main sort of battleground for any policy is the question, will AMLO have the institutional tools at hand to get it done, right? And that requires looking into the institutions, seeing what the internal mechanisms are that sustain corruption, that underpin collusion, and that ultimately have hindered reforms as they have been imposed in different shapes and different intensities over the last 12 years, and before that, indeed, since 2000, especially the democratic transition, of course. So let me get right into it and talk through some of the main points while still, of course, wiggling room for discussion afterwards. So as already mentioned, we are sort of seeing a more complex scenario than just a uniform conflict in Mexico. But organized crime in Mexico, as we all know here, but still that hasn't been translated into policy, as it were, into another policy direction, is that organized crime in Mexico has mutated and is in plain mutation these days still. It was always a bit more complicated than that, but stereotypically it could still represent sort of like the field of organized crime and the main drivers of conflict in 2006 as a field dominated by a handful of larger organizations, mostly dedicated to drugs trafficking and drugs production. Now, over time, of course, in an interaction with the militarized policy, as we know, that has become more complicated. Now we have a very fragmented actor set, and we have had the diversification of income-generating activities. And as a point of reflection to the current debate on legalization of marijuana, legalization of poppy for the pharmaceutical industry, even though they are in principle laudable, I think they're by no means a magic wand for, curbing organized crime power, specifically because they have mutated into more warlord-type figures in many regions that control local civilian populations that rely, amongst other things, much more heavily on extortion, on protection rackets as a business than on drugs trafficking. In the region I'm most familiar with to date, in Michoacán, you actually have a lot of smaller groups that have been cut off from the drugs trade, are not main beneficiaries from the drugs trade anymore, as their mother structure, the Knights Templar, fragmented following the federal intervention and the rise of the autodefensas in 2013. But they have even so become much more socially harmful as they have begun to directly prey on local businesses as a main business. They derive much of the income from extorting lime producers, and they still extort avocado producers, among other things of a more, harmful nature, so to speak. And of course, atomization has been a theme in the discussion on Mexico over the last years, but I think the degree, its depth is still being underestimated. Just share one concrete anecdote from my own sort of fieldwork process over the last 10 years with you. When I first stepped foot into Tierra Caliente, the hotland region in Michoacán, I was able to negotiate sort of like my permanence in the field with one organization, with one actor, essentially. That was the cartel boss at the time. I traveled into Apatzingan, sort of like the cradle of drug trafficking in the region, and they took notice of my presence instantly, sent over an envoy, and had a few questions, what the Whitey was doing in that territory, and if I might be working for the DEA. When I had successfully left clear that that wasn't the case, they told me, okay, you can stay here, you can do things, you can travel around, and so on and so forth, because, they had a specific propagandistic interest at the time to get their story out and so on. So they saw an opportunity in my presence, so to speak. When I go to the same villages I've been building contacts in now, I cannot travel over the main road anymore. I have to travel through back roads, I have to like cross orchards, and to get to the village, actually I have to wade through a river because the village is now cut off from the asphalted road because the territories between the city and the village are held by so-called contras, which are blocks also splintered off from the Knights Templar organization, which are now considered enemies, basically. For the village, that means, that sometimes there's a virtual state of siege in the sense that the contras will not let through food, they will not let water through for an extended period of time, and the local priest will not even make it into the village anymore, which is grave for a highly, deeply Catholic community. So, and for the foot soldiers, you get to talk to when you are in those communities, which many times are literally child soldiers, a lot of really wafer-thin statues there, and still kind of surprising how they can hold up those, Kalashnikovs without falling over and calling it a day, as it were. But they do. Anyways, for them, it means they now die for minimal territorial advances, battling between those different armed groups takes place over, this hill, that patch of the river, that road, and so on and so forth. And as soon as they've taken it over, they hold it for 2 or 3 weeks, and then it gets taken back. So what you have is essentially you have a micro-geopolitical gridlock in many of those regions, which sort of tells you part of the story of why the homicide stats have been pointing up so immensely. Because none of those groups has currently the strength to take over and to pacify, as it were. So it's a very complicated situation. And further complicating the matter, of course, is that you have state actors, including federal security forces, intimately involved with those armed groups. They're a factor in perpetuating as resources to those armed groups, in part because they don't necessarily appear as strict and to be feared guardians of the law. They can be that at times, but at other times, and there's somebody you can deal with, you can negotiate with on an everyday basis. So we talked to a few coordinators of armed groups that coordinate their armed wings, essentially, and they all stressed to us how essential it was for them to obtain information about state operations, also about enemy groups from local military commanders, for instance, basically, either against pay or in exchange for intelligence they themselves hold on other groups, which they can also trade for state internal information, which then sort of like underpins an interplay in the sense that armed forces and police, to some degree, can operate and have something to show for at the end of the day. So this is one specific conflict setting that we describe in the report. We also take up the cases of Guanajuato, where you have a dramatically different scenario. And we take up the case of Ecatepec, just on the outskirts of Mexico City, where we conducted field work as well. And all of that is to highlight that in complexity in the conflict setting, the conflict landscape we see nowadays in Mexico, and just to call for fine-tuned understandings. First of all, a conversation about what's going on in the first place, to then build that sound basis for more effective policy solutions ultimately. Talking about the inside of institutions. So, as I mentioned, there have been a lot of reform attempts, and those have failed in great part, at least, how elements familiar with those structures internally tell it, because not necessarily there's always a lack of will by officers, especially junior officers, many times go into institutions and have quite high hopes for what they can do, that it might be an honorable profession. We encountered it very strongly in the case of Veracruz, where we conducted field work 1.5 years ago, and where we routinely saw junior officers being coerced into criminal obedience by superiors on the basis of what we have come to call violent hierarchies or violent bureaucracies, in the sense that once you enter those institutions, you become absorbed into networks which are controlled usually by some higher up officers that, coerce the legality out of newcomers, so to speak. And that really is the core mechanism, we think, that perpetuates, collusion, corruption, and thus undermines the effectiveness of security policies, however they may however they may be well designed in the end. So in essence, we think those are the two main fields of obstacles and fields of action that an incoming government needs to take up, needs to, first of all, be frank about, to then take concrete steps, because any policy will fall or be successful in accordance to advances made in those very fields. There's no way around it, basically. So that would pretty much be the general shape of the recommendations that we are emitting, to produce local knowledge and to break open the black boxes that security institutions remain to date. To do that and to ultimately, as a priority, protect the essential basic rights of junior officers, you need transparency mechanisms with teeth, as it were. That is, of course, I mean, something that a lot of actors have called for, that Ola has called for, amongst others. But what we concretely understand in this case, without amplifying the argument of how to create transparency, is that you need internal oversight bodies within police. Federal police would be a good place to start. Ultimately, the armed forces would be desirable, although that's a different and much tougher negotiation because of the dependence of public security provision in Mexico on the armed forces in its current state. So there is a possibility of backlash. But to have external oversight bodies that have administrative possibilities to act against corrupt higher-ranking officers, to actually discipline in that sense. And I'd like to just do one final remark, how we think the idea of truth commissions, as has been, of course, prominently floated by the incoming government, at least as an attempt, could play a positive role to address those issues. Now, of course, I mean, as you will have seen, as you will have read, as you will have noticed, is that the pacification forums that were organized by the incoming government, unfortunate terminology as it is, but there was quite a bit of backlash, in the sense that the government was very rash, perhaps even, to call for the forgiveness of victims, basically. That caused some sour reactions, and I think has the potential to undermine the very potentiality of peace-building measures if they're not communicated in a more suave form. So what we call for in the report is for truth commissions to be designed in a more open-ended fashion, that no concrete measures will be discarded a priori, in order to equip whichever policy is designed in the process of those conversations that should take place in those, on those platforms that truth commissions could be, to be equipped with legitimacy and to be designed under broad participation in order for them to be carried ultimately by local actors that know what's going on and that can ultimately implement whichever policy, or help implement and carry whichever policy will be defined. Truth commissions could also, by bringing together local actors, regular citizens, civil society actors, open a window into local conflict realities, specifically if they're implemented on a local level, and if they're equipped with the leeway to define their own agenda, always in, well, tight communication and tight interaction with state forces, of course, but there should be a lot of civil society participation built into that for the sake of their functionality beyond other reasons, of course. And those could then become laboratories for defining those fine-tuned policy solutions that I was talking about earlier, and ultimately, hopefully, produce such a thing as a policy line effective in trying and turning the ship around, as it were. As part thereof, we also call on the government, on the incoming government, not to categorically exclude measures that could help prevent a violent backlash by local armed actors against peace-building instruments, because we're talking about their implementation in very active conflict scenarios. So that's a big dilemma the government is going to be faced with. And we think that they should at least consider and put up for discussion, for instance, within the framework of truth commissions, whether reduced sentences to organized crime members might or might not be something that Mexican society or specific localities might be willing to consider and might be willing to consider. That also sort of speaks to the necessity not to rush a decision of where Mexican society wants to land on a revenge versus forgiveness continuum, but impulse a very necessary debate that's just barely beginning and that cannot be rushed for there not to be a backlash in terms of disenchantment with the new government, which could ultimately turn hope into frustration and frustration into a demand for more radical political forces if this very, well, from the outside, leftist, populist government, which really is a very suave form of almost social democracy in my opinion these days. I mean, there's nothing compared, I think, to the radicalness that the Brazilian candidate brings to the table. And that could turn sour and also turn to right-wing solutions in the foreseeable future if we're not careful and if this government does not assume its immense historical responsibility at this point. So, yes, and I'd also like to just repeat the teaser that Ivan just mentioned about the story about the young Sicario that I interviewed, that I spent some time with a while ago, who went through different armed groups, was passed along. He entered those circles as a youngster. He was underage when he was recruited by force. He was given the choice to either perish or become part of, or parte de, as they say locally. And I think who himself sort of mutated into a, into a ruthless killer at some point. At least he was known as such when I knew him, when I got to talk to him and interview him, before he was killed himself, basically because he had been sort of thrown out of the Knights Templar structure, of that cartel structure. Then he became part of the autodefensa structure in order to stay afloat. He was considered a traitor, according to local narco culture, and there's no forgiveness for that. He wanted out at that point, but he didn't know where to run, who to turn to, basically. And I'm not saying I have a solution for those kind of cases, but I think it really reflects sort of like the moral dilemma that Mexican society will be faced with over the foreseeable future. What do you want to do with those guys? Do you want to try to invest in them? Do you want to try to demobilize, to invest into demobilization for the sake of stability? Or do you go down the punish and revenge route? And that's something we're very far from resolving these days. So,
Great.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
No,
Thank you very much. A lot of issues there. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions and discussion. Thank you, folks. Maureen.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks for the invitation. Obviously, thanks to the International Crisis Group for writing a very timely report, and I think an important contribution as we all sort of think about what this next stage of Mexico will be in terms of a transition right now, and then what the next almost 6 years, it's actually going to be a 5-year, 10-month presidency, to really what does that mean for Mexico, and on the expectation that both, as you certainly laid out, the Mexican population has, but I think internationally too, of will this be Mexico's moment of significant change, or which we all would hope for, or are we going to see ongoing concerns of violence and weak institutions? Just comment a few minutes on parts of the report and then areas I think it'd be important to also consider as we look at what's happening in Mexico. And I think, Falco, clearly the really important value of the report is all the local realities that you lay out here. I think we tend to sometimes look at the national view of what's happening in Mexico and the big numbers and not have the time to really look at how Michoacan is different than the state of Mexico or Veracruz or any other part of, and how the local conflicts differ in different areas, and certainly the enormous challenges that Mexico is facing across the board in terms of the local versus national, but also I think what you laid out, and I found fascinating interviewing with federal officials from the military or from the federal police of how many internal obstacles there are to profound change, even if you have a government that might want to address accountability, change structures. You have concerns about collusion with organized crime. from all federal and state municipal security forces, but also internal resistance, or as you've laid out, and there's been multiple studies of how many times people go into local police, federal police, and get co-opted into a sort of criminal structure within that institution. So I wanted to really focus on a few of those institutional issues, and I think certainly as the report lays out, impunity is probably the main kind of issue in Mexico, which is the real failure the Mexican government has had at all levels to hold anyone accountable for crimes, whether that be officials accused of collusion or human rights violations to just common crimes. I was looking at the report that Mexico Evalúa had done of Mexico's judicial system, and their national estimate of impunity is around 87%. And the last victimization survey in Mexico would show that about 93% of crimes in Mexico are either not reported or not investigated. And certainly, a lot of that is a lack of trust in the institutions, or others don't report crimes because they think it's a waste of time. So I think we're really looking at an enormous challenge of Mexico's criminal justice system, which includes the police and then the judicial reform. I think on accountability, and I would agree with the recommendations that the report lays out in terms of the need to strengthen both internal and external controls. One of the main concerns that WOLA has had, as have a lot of organizations that oppose the internal security law, is that law does nothing to really improve the gaps in accountability for Mexico's armed forces. Beyond the further militarization of public security, that one huge gap, as we've seen in our own research of very few convictions, about 4% of convictions for soldiers implicated in human rights violations in a 4-year period, really highlights that need to strengthen those accountability, because you can't have trust in your population, in the police or the military, if they are considered to be able to commit crimes or abuse in impunity. And so I think those are clear. It needs to be strengthened. I wonder on the federal police in particular. There have been a lot of proposals put forward during the Calderon administration that were sort of ignored in these past sexennial on how do you expand external controls. And so I think there's one proposal that was out there at the time. I would love to see a comeback of an external police auditor. I mean, CIDE and other organizations really put together, I think, an important model based on looking at different examples internationally on how do you have an auditor that really looks at your internal affairs unit and has an oversight of how they carry out their investigations, or are they able to assist certain cases? And I think that would be an interesting thing to see. We may also see on external controls actually a resolution by the International Court on Human Rights against Mexico that precisely focuses on external controls over the police. The case of Atenco, so at least 11 women that had been sexually tortured and raped by state and federal security forces in 2006, went before the Inter-American Court in November of last year. And one of the things the victims and their legal representatives really called for was we need to have more external controls over our police forces. It's not enough to just have the internal affairs units, which certainly should function better, but we also want stronger external controls, whether that be more teeth to your human rights commissions, but also other types of models. And so I think Mexico may be actually ordered in a nice be favorable to really look at how do you have better controls over your security forces. One area, and Falco, I'd be curious to see what you think of it in terms of your work in a state like Michoacan, is how do we focus more on what's the role of the state governors in all of this? And it has to do with both better policing and institutional, like judicial reforms, but even the internal security law, because I think one of the sort of missed opportunities in that law, even if we're going to have any kind of period where the armed forces remain in public securities, how do you develop conditions on the governors so that they really need to strengthen their state police force or their municipal police force when they call to bring in the military? Because it's very easy, as an easy, I think, solution for a governor to be like, go bring in the military again. It makes it look like you're doing something. And we've seen it, and we've had more than a decade of very little, I think, results in terms of improving security in the states where you have the military, and in part because the governors haven't been forced to do the tough job of investing more in their state-level security forces. And you're looking at soldiers on the street might look good, but they're not able to prevent crimes. They certainly shouldn't be investigating crimes. And so I think how do we focus? And I'd be curious to see how your view of like where do we put the governors in this whole scenario? I mean, right now I was looking at for 2019. I think the PRI will control 14 governorships. PAN will have 12. Morena has 5. PRD, and then 2 other parties have between them 3. So I think it's a different scenario politically, and how do we get the state level to also commit to this? Because we sort of focus on Mexico as a federal system, and they certainly control a lot of the funds to influence policy, but I think that could also be used to really get the states to assume more of their role. Two more areas, and I'll open, I'm sure lots of questions for you all, on judicial reform. And I think the report does lay out the need to have more judicial independence. There is, right now, Mexico's on the verge of replacing their Attorney General's office at the federal level, the PGR, with an independent Fiscalía General, the National Prosecutor's Office, where the head will be named through a process of nominations from the Senate sent to the president, and then he sends back 3 candidates. As the current proposal is that would be picked from a much more autonomous body from the executive branch. We view this as a historic opportunity, not just for the independence, but how do you restructure, the PGR, for example, so that it's not as compartmentalized of different special prosecutors, but have teams that can investigate crimes in a different way. So we certainly, I think, support and believe that's one of the key issues. But the other is the justice reforms themselves, which started a decade ago, and where we're still seeing, and mentioned Mexico Evalua's report, they still assess it would take 10 years still for Mexico's criminal justice system in terms of the new adversarial system to be fully operational. So we see so many cases fall apart because evidence isn't gathered in the right way, it's contaminated, you don't have control of chain of custody, to a lack of cooperation between prosecutors, judges, and forensics. I think there's a huge challenge in really investing resources in Mexico's criminal justice system that needs to be a priority for the next government, because yes, you should be supporting and reforming your security forces, but you have really good police operating in a structure that isn't working, they're not going to be able to do their job either. And I think there's going to be that frustration. Yeah. So really hoping that the new government invests what you need in the judicial reform. There's a really fascinating study that Animal Político had done looking at homicides. And I think they'd estimate out 5% of homicides in the whole country ever investigated. But it has great profiles of prosecutors who end up waiting for a day before you get even the forensics to come for identifying homicide victims. And there's, just a lack of resources and a lack of personnel that I think really needs to be addressed. And lastly, I really appreciate the fact that you had a focus on victims in Mexico and all the discussion on Truth Commission and how do you, come to terms with over a decade of violence and what we've seen of at least 37,000 disappeared people. I think the estimate's likely twice that in terms of where organizations that work with families have gone through the official database and say, that person's not here. A lot of their registry doesn't match, but certainly an enormous crisis. And I do think there have been proposals put forward by Mexican organizations. There's a platform against impunity and corruption that has a large proposal on transitional justice and Truth Commission, and we'd like to see, I think, that moving forward, because it is how do you come to terms with what's happened if you don't know. You don't have all of that, local buy-in. I think it's been interesting to see all of the forums that the transition team has held throughout the country, and you've had victims come out. They actually announced yesterday, the day before, they're canceling the rest of them, which is caused a lot of upset in states like Morelia, Tamaulipas, where they have not gone and will not go now. And I think it's also a sense of lack of planning, but feeling overwhelmed as a transition team of, oh my God, it's really this bad in our country. And I think that is something that they will need to address, and wanted to highlight on that because it's not really laid out as much in the report, and something that we've been working on, which is the disappearance side of things and the implementation of the general law on disappearances. Because if you look at the one huge meeting in Mexico City on September 14th, where you had López Obrador, Olga Sánchez, Encina, so his team that's working on human rights and reconciliation, meeting with the peace movement. So Javier Cecilia was there, and a lot of the collectives of family members. And what they presented and what their main demand is, we want this law to be implemented. Because you have a law that was put together based on participation of victims and experts on what does a structure look like to search for people. How do you have your better national database for exhumations and, searching for people? And I think it's an area where there's just such a great need. And when you look at it, I appreciate there was an area in U.S. assistance where there's also, I think, a lot of need for international assistance if you want to provide answers to families. I mean, they certainly want to know who did this, but I think so many families just want to know where their loved ones are. And where you have, the structure in place, and also such a I think a need for technical assistance. We were in Coahuila with our board in April, and they were saying between Coahuila and Nuevo León, there was 15 tons of remains that they've uncovered. I mean, that's just like, there's over 1,000 mass graves that have been found in Mexico. If anyone's seen the news about Jalisco in the past year, it's some gruesome truck of bodies that doesn't have a place to go. And so I think it's an area where there really needs to be, with this new government, a focus. If we want to look at any type of reconciliation or pacification or justice, it's giving answers to families. And that comes to a lot of the technical forensic part of just simply knowing where your loved one is amongst all of the tragedies that's happened. So I will leave it at that, but I think appreciate that you're working on this report and look forward to further conversations with everyone.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Maureen. That was excellent. We're going to open up the floor. I know you probably want to respond maybe to some of the things Maureen said, but let me start with just a general question, just sort of stepping back a little bit, without getting into a lot of the details. When we had an event with López Obrador, we did it with the Wilson Center at a few months before the election. And I asked him about some of these issues. And what's striking to me was that his response then, and this is what I really want to get a sense from all of you, was that somehow that his focus was going to be on reducing inequality and poverty, and reducing, and the solution to the crime and violence was to have a more equal society, to produce jobs, really to address these vast differences in wealth. And then he was asked about corruption, and then he talked about, well, I'm honest, and so I'm the model, and this will kind of spread throughout the society because they'll see that honesty is. And then he talks about, austerity, lowering salaries for government officers. Well, if you want to get good people to do the crucial things that's really on the line in Mexico, you're going to have to get very competent professionals and pay them well, have them well trained and so forth. And so if you reduce everybody's salary, it's going to be hard to attract. So I just want to get a sense from you of really how, certainly it was not reassuring what his answer was back then, but obviously the time has gone by. Perhaps he's sort of recognized, as Maureen was alluding, that, wow, this is really a major problem. And it's not enough, as important as reducing poverty and inequality is, and the social agenda, that's really, this needs to be tackled. And we have to get the best people, and we have to give a lot of resources. And the country's not going to advance unless we focus on it. Is that there's that sense, or it's just kind of we're doing this as another area, but our real priority is really on the social question? I don't know if you have a sense of how this all fits in, just sort of stepping back.
Would you like me to have a first go at that question? Absolutely. I think that the social issue is absolutely crucial to López Obrador. And the austerity within the state and the equalizing of salaries within the state is something which he's made an absolute priority. To be honest, the issue of the minimum wage, the pathetic minimum wage, which Mexico has, minimum wage, it's below the poverty line, less than $5 a day, which is will immediately correct, if I'm not mistaken, the northern states in the start of next year, and then roll out across the country. That was an open goal for any political candidate in Mexico to address, and he did. And obviously that is a crucial. I mean, Mexico has still 50% poverty. Its inequality rate remains extremely high. But I would draw attention just to a couple of graphics we have at the back of the report, which I think complicate the issue a little bit on the issue, on the connection between poverty, inequality, and crime. If you see our appendix, we don't go into this in great depth. The Appendix D, we probably need to do some more research on this. This was prepared by our in-house economist. The most violent regions are not the poorest regions of Mexico, and they're not even the most unequal regions of Mexico. The most peaceful region of Mexico is Yucatan, and also one of the, if I'm not mistaken, probably one of the poorest as well. So there is no clear connection. No doubt there are pockets of relative deprivation in large urban areas where organized crime successfully nestles. But organized crime's presence responds to a lot of other factors as well, including the relative strategic location of the different places in which it's operating. So that would be a first thought on that. I think as regards the broader connection between corruption in the state and dealing with corruption, lowering wages in the state and dealing with insecurity, obviously this is a huge issue, which is it's very difficult to predict what would be the effect of lowering top officials' wages on corruption. One would have to assume that the most important effect will be raising the wages of police officers and low-ranking security personnel rather than lowering those at the very top. It might well cause a drain of certain high quality of officials, probably from some of the more technocratic institutions, which we will start to see over time. But I'm not sure that it will have the effect on corruption, actually fomenting more corruption, so long as it is backed by a sustained prosecution of those individuals who are found guilty of corruption, which raises the issue of what Maureen has said. It's not just about wages. It's not just about López Obrador's undoubtedly Spartan lifestyle. It's about prosecuting the people who are found guilty, whether they are political allies or not. And that is an open question in Mexico, quite frankly. We simply do not know because, as I think most people in this room are aware, over the last few years, Mexico has stood out for its absolute failure to address well-proven cases of corruption, such as Odebrecht, amongst them.
Walker, you want to add anything?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's a lot in there. I think in terms of inequality, we had a bit of discussion there. I think there's still a lot to be understood in terms of the correlations. Ground, so we're a bit careful with that in the report as well.
Yes.
But in general, I mean, if you look at sort of, especially like the underage recruitment phenomenon into organized crime, I think it's very clear that there's, I think, two sort of like mechanisms at work that yes, there's very few opportunities in many places where youngsters do take up arms and become part of armed structures, basically, because literally there's nothing else imaginable. And then also because of preponderance of local narco culture, which hasn't started just 12 years back when it became sort of like a thing in the discussion and so on and so forth, but goes back decades in some areas where families have been involved in the narco economy to some degree, which is kind of like muted into a war economy on a local level as well. Say, for instance, there have been small-time peasants, and now they partially stay afloat catering to the local armed cell that's stationed in their village, right? And the sons see that they have contact with those guys. Of course, there's a conveyance of certain values there as well, but also through the families that sometimes to generate extra income, see it as a legitimate career choice of the children to become part of armed structures, right? So I think both factors, they are very, very important to take into account, especially, and there, I mean, AMLO obviously has a point saying like we need to reactivate El Campo, the agriculture, because I mean, that's been shamefully neglected since the 1980s, essentially, and I think underpins a lot of problems of what we're seeing today. And you look at Tamaulipas to a degree, Sinaloa is a classical case where, unfortunately, one of the forums was canceled as well, which is, I think, a very grave signal not to do that in the very heartland of, Mexican narco trafficking. Historically, it's fatal. And in Michoacán and Guerrero, of course, as well. So, yes, I think also, I mean, it will be prominent in his policy line already because of the fact that he caters to a certain audience, to a certain block of voters, local communities in a very classic and a bit maybe worryingly paternalist fashion. So I think we will have to see of what, in terms of like, well, clientelism and paternalism will be or not eradicated when he invests money into social programs. Because traditionally, that has sort of, underpinned social control, patronage over local communities, over blocks of voters, and a lot of money has been embezzled in those processes traditionally. That's been one of the big games of getting, your pockets filled, so to speak. So again, leading back to the question, will he be able to create transparency and actually create, prosecutorial services, justice services and financial oversight mechanisms that are actually effective. It's always the same question. It always leads back to that conundrum, right? Wages, yes. I think, people who work as consultants, for instance, for Morena in the Cámara de Diputados, in the lower house of Congress, been talking to, there's a lot of potential there. There's a lot of very motivated people that are not just there for the wages and for that, but that actually still believe there's change to be affected under López Obrador. But some of them are already kind of growing a little bit fed up with the wild mixture that Morena is in the inside. Mm-hmm. It's a very eclectic sort of just conglomeration of different political forces, or not even political forces, just different actors, many of which do not have the slightest political experience. And for some of those consultants, which are very highly trained, you can also, education in the US and so on, classic Mexican, of course, elite profile, they just want to rip their heads off, basically. So it's interesting to hear, and they're very frank about it.
Thanks. Maureen?
Briefly, I think his economic policies and equality will continue to be key points for him. Even when he spoke before the victims movement on September 14th, he began with the education, scholarships, all of the economic policies. And finally, it started to get into, but we will bring justice and work for answers for your children. But I think those economic issues will continue to be core. On these institutional areas, though, I think some key moments will be, one, how the new government reacts to a proposal for a national anti-corruption policy. We hosted with you all the discussion in May on Mexico's national anti-corruption system. They are putting together this series of consultations nationally on what a policy will look like to address corruption, and that should be presented in December. So again, how the new government reacts to those proposals and commits to, the corruption area. And the other, which I think is a recommendation that was laid out in the crisis group's report on emblematic cases, and do you make progress? I would argue that members of his transition team and advisors have that clear, that you need to start showing results on key cases. If you look at the way López Obrador and his team have reacted to the case of the 43 students from Ayotzinapa, he met with the families on the anniversary of their disappearance. He committed to creating the investigative commission that's called for in Mexico's judicial ruling to investigate the case, but also called for international assistance on the case from the UN, from the Inter-American Commission. I think across the board they are very open to international technical assistance. As we think here about the U.S. role or others, even on corruption, we've heard they wanted to look at, UN assistance for procurement processes. How do you review government contracts? And so I think we'll have to see how they, one, react to that once they're in office, but also people want answers. And I think if you start prosecuting some of the bigger corruption scandals and human rights cases, you'll start to hopefully see a bigger commitment, and I think a belief within Mexicans that, yes, you can actually hold people accountable for these crimes.
I think just to add, it's frankly worrying that the case which we covered in great depth last year on Veracruz, the former governor Javier Duarte ended up with a
9 years?
9-year prison sentence for massive fraud and presiding over a state in which thousands were disappeared.
Let's open it up, and if you could just wait for the microphone, please identify yourselves. We'll start with in the front row with Hattie Babbitt. And if you want to direct it to one of the speakers or just make a general comment or question, either way.
Well, I'll direct. Is it on? Yeah. I'll direct it to Maureen. I just wanted to dig a little deeper on your idea of what's the role of the governors and what's the role of, in effect, local governments. In the United States, there's some splendid state and city and even county mechanisms, but they all have taxing authority and control over their judicial and prosecutorial systems. And I don't understand enough about the Mexican systems to understand how useful that might be, but in line with the recent comment about López Obrador needs to find some successful examples to demonstrate to folks that things can happen. One way to do that is the laboratory of the various states.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Thank you. My name is Roger Carter. I'm from the Embassy of Trinidad and Tobago. So this discussion has I mean, a lot of interest for me because Trinidad and Tobago has a lot of the elements of Mexico in the early stages, but most of it is there. And I wish I had a month to speak to you guys rather than just a short time, because there's so much that you've been able to crystallize in my own mind as I've observed the security landscape in Trinidad and Tobago for quite some time, over a 30-year military history, career. So a lot of people try to understand the roots of violence. You have to strip away the complexity. I mean, it's a very complex situation, or we wouldn't be here. But if we strip away the complexity, my observation is the root of criminal violence really has a lot to do with the issue of conflict. And when I say that, we have to understand the geospatial conflict, the resource scarcity conflict, the issue of historical tensions, and overlay on top of that political conflict that really is in the space. And governments don't understand. So you spoke about multiple types of conflict. So there's a conflict that is happening for resources among illegal actors, but then the government comes and overlays onto that state conflict and superimposes upon the situation, thereby increasing the violence, in my view. So in that situation, my question is, how does the government, on the one hand, de-escalate the conflict between illegitimate actors without at the same time increasing the state versus these actors' conflict? Is there a way to actually manage that?
Great, thank you. So another question, right? Why don't we take one here? Yeah, please.
Thank you. I'm a former OAS lawyer working for the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. And
what's your name?
Bertha Santos Coy. And thank you for your exposition. That was very interesting, and that shows what is happening in Mexico. Not only now, but it's been for decades, years, and that's what it gives the feeling of more than asking something. I mean, we only have questions. We don't have answers. So probably it's too soon. But knowing the history in Mexico, I believe it's very difficult. I was born in Tamaulipas. That's what I know, what is happening. So my question is in relation to the Truth Commission. Is this Truth Commission includes justice? In my experience with the Truth Commission in Haiti, people get so disappointed if they don't get justice. As far as they start telling you about the violations on human rights, they are expecting for some justice, for that the cases go to a judge, and then they have some justice in this case.
Great, thank you. Why don't we go start, and then we'll take another round. Maybe Maureen, you could start with Hattie's question, and then we can get other comments.
No, it's a great question, because I think for far too long we've seen in Mexico, as you highlighted with the budget issue, is how the federal budget is used as a political tool to at times punish governors, or I think what even the report mentions, looking at the use of subsidies for security, where opposition parties don't always receive federal subsidies at the level they should. And so I think, how will this government, address that issue of the power that the federal government continues to have over the budget? I think the clearest example was in Chihuahua as well, when you have a governor, Javier Corral, who was elected on an anti-corruption platform, who has 11 indictments against the past governor, and also was investigating 3 federal officials for embezzlement in the state, and where you had, as of the end of last year, efforts to withhold federal funding to Chihuahua, sort of as punishment for this. And then to this day, the governor, who is believed to be here, Cesar Duarte, has not been extradited, and there's a lot of, I think, the political maneuvering there. And so I think it is a big challenge. But in the flip side, I think, from the role of international communities, how can we highlight states that are doing a good job? I think Chihuahua is one of the states where you've probably had more progress made on some better policing. The U.S. has also supported their state-level police efforts, to anti-corruption efforts, to strengthen the judicial system even before the criminal justice reform started in 2008. And I think it is going to be, in that adjustment of how the states in Mexico have sometimes a greater role and greater power to do their own policies than just the federal government. Clearly, though, I think it's sort of up to see where this government will decide to use the power of the purse in terms of priorities of subsidies, what kind of subsidies. One of the overall concerns on the criminal justice reform is that the subsidies currently available are all focused on public security, so not defense attorneys or other parts of attention to victims. So I think it is going to be a very big area, but we would say that in the past few years, some of the best examples of doing innovative ideas have come from the states, including Tamaulipas, which is actually doing interesting work on exhumations and identification of remains, the same with Nuevo León. And so I think there's areas where we could see progress made without just focusing on what the federal government is doing. Yeah. You want to add to that?
Yeah, I just want to add a very brief comment. I think that's absolutely right. And right now there's a lot of opportunities for municipalities, specific municipalities, perhaps specific states, to work as laboratories for good practices. And then the job will be to systemize those and to spread those and to export those to other states, and we can also, of course, look at the international level for that. But specifically in Mexico, Friday we'll be presenting in Mexico City, and on the panel we'll have the police chief of the town of Jalapa in Veracruz, which has been held by Morena for about 9 months time now, basically. And they're rebuilding the municipal police, which have been completely canceled out, as has happened in many municipalities where you have no municipal police anymore because of corruption, because of collusion, and because of political factors. And they're rebuilding it from the bottom up. So it'll be very interesting to see, how those kind of experiences can then be related to other localities. And one of the things we discussed is actually, trying to set up workshops in collaboration with a Mexican collective called CACEDE, which you know, to sort of bring together different police from different municipalities and different parties to see what they have to say and how they can interlink. So that I think it's a very good approach to see those as potential laboratories. In terms of the Truth Commission and sort of like the tension between justice and truth, I think the most important thing to sort of smooth out those contradictions and potential tensions that could be fatal to the very instruments and their functionality would be to, as I said, sort of design them open-endedly for ultimately the participants to take that decision. I just want to mention that of course, justice, especially in emblematic cases, is necessary to signal towards the future that we will not tolerate impunity. But at the same time, when you talk to victims, and especially mothers, collectives, such in Veracruz, that have been looking for the disappeared children for years and have been doing the job of the state instead of the state and have learned forensics and have learned, due diligence and so on and so forth, they have become the real experts. So you have two situations there. The first one is they can tell the actual prosecutors and other state bodies a whole lot of how things are ideally done. There's very good practices there. They have a lot of experience and just have been driven to learn how it works, how they can work the system. So very valuable experience there. And a lot of them are not necessarily out for revenge. As Maureen has mentioned, they just want to know what happened, and they want to know, where their children have been buried, basically. So I'm not saying that should be the only approach to that question between justice and truth, but as people grow more intimate with those sort of like search processes and the digestion of the painful past, they sometimes develop a suaver stance towards the question, which I think can be interesting as one element of the wider discussion, right? Then
can I add some just really quickly on that, because something we've been just prompted me thinking about is that I think some of the proposals do have a justice component, but I think what this government is also going to need to face is the truth of we may never know, in a lot of cases, actually what happened to people's children and where the perpetrators are also gone. And I think how do you come to, there's a colleague who mentioned the word inencontrables, people that are never going to be found because there's simply nothing left of them. And so I think in terms of this truth and reconciliation also, how does the government offer some sort of reparations to that? I think if you look at the Juarez murders as a case in that. There's been several women and girls who were never identified either, and where they've looked at different ways to repair the damages done to the families through creating women's health centers, women's justice centers, all other areas where certainly you want to know where the perpetrators are, but then sometimes we just can't. How else? And this is part of, I think, the discussions. What are the other ways that you can offer reparations to families when you just never might know all the answers?
I'll just come in quickly there. On the Veracruz front, we have spoken extensively with the families, relatives of the disappeared there. And one of the problems they've faced is that they're a good-intentioned prosecutor dealing with disappeared cases with an office of how many people? 2, 3? It's absolutely a tiny unit looking into thousands and thousands of cases of an extreme complexity going years into the past. I mean, obviously there would ideally be a huge injection of resources into that very process, and hopefully these truth commissions might in principle be the form in which those resources will be channeled. I just want to come back on the question from the gentleman from Trinidad and Tobago. I appreciate that you have in your island complex security issues not made any easier by the problems from Venezuela at the moment. To a degree, there's a bit of spillover of violence and weapons from Venezuela. I think if you're looking at, what is you have extremely complex origins of conflict and violence across Latin America and the Caribbean. What are the approaches? Well, ideally, you need a police which can combine two skill sets which are not always compatible. One is intelligence to be able to identify the most harmful organizations and go for the most harmful organizations, send out a clear message that certain forms of behavior and certain forms of violence are not acceptable and will be punished with all the force of the law, and combine that with the ability to work at the community level, to have deep penetration within the community, which of course was the art and the skill of the Nicaraguan police until it was turned to use for other purposes. But that is a very hard combination to create. Now, if you look in the concrete case of Mexico, as Falco has mentioned, time and again over recent years, municipal police forces have been disbanded because they have been co-opted by criminality, not just by one criminal group. In the case of Acapulco, if I'm not mistaken, which was disbanded, the municipal police force at the end of September, 2 criminal groups had sort of staked out different parts of the police forces, so they were actually fighting their own battles through the police force, which is one of the main reasons why Acapulco is one of the most violent cities in Latin America at the moment. So, the classic response to the Mexican government, disband the municipal police, send in the militarized federal police, or send in the military directly. But that doesn't solve the problem either. So to bring back the municipal civilian police, which will be an essential part of getting to that intelligence, getting the community presence, there will need to be a restoration of confidence. And it's those measures which restore the confidence in the re-entry of the civilian police, which we believe are so important at the moment. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Let's do another round. Yes, we'll go on this thing. We want to ignore you.
The corner.
Hi, hello. My name is Francisco Barrera, and I am from Coahuila, a border town, cartel area. I am a lawyer criminal lawyer in Mexico. I worked for 10 years over there. You mentioned a little bit of the narco culture that has been from the 80s, at the end of the 70s and the 80s, very root in Mexico. Culture there, with the corridos and movies that has been developed and still now has been on the radio and on the TV. Do you see any actions, specific actions from the government or the future government from Manuel López Obrador to prohibit that, similar to what's happening in Colombia with the narcos?
Thank you. Yes, sir. Back.
Yes, thank you. My name is Luis Alberto Salgado. I'm a human rights lawyer, Peruvian. I would like to ask you, whether, to which extent Andrés Manuel López Obrador is willing and able to confront really these problems. I And I think a test would be concerning his cabinet. Have you made any political analysis, or you have any important information as far as who will be the members of his cabinet that will be appointed? We call them Ministro de Estado, Secretario de Estado, because they are key issues. And finally, I say this because I have confronted personally with these guys, ministers, Presidente del Consejo de Ministros, and they are key to, and they reflect the will and the real intentions of the president. So if you have any information concerning that, that would be, I think, an important sign of to which extent we, López Obrador, will be able to fulfill his promises and we'll have an effective government. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll have one right next to you, and then we'll go up here.
Hi, my name is Marta Guerrero. Thank you very much for this very interesting topic and the research. I think it's very illustrating on the issue of security. As someone mentioned, I'm also Tamaulipeca.
Wow.
So that's why we're obviously here because we suffer and our families suffer from the violence in Mexico and especially in Tamaulipas and northern states. In this matter, I was curious about the role of municipalities in actually conducting and responding to security threats by the narco cartels. And I wonder, because to stand up against the narco, it requires a lot of courage. And it requires to know that you will be target to the narcos, but not only you, but your family, your beloved ones, everything you have, you might lose it all and you might die in the process. Or if you don't die, even worse, you will see everyone you know will die or disappear. So I wonder what comes first, because people do not expect the government nor the police nor the military to actually take action or help you. So without that support from the organizations and the justice system, what comes first? The municipality work, the municipality or the civil society work, or the justice system improving? I wonder, it's sort of like chicken and the egg kind of problem. And I would like your thoughts on that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. This gentleman here. Yeah, we'll go to you later. I'm sorry, we're going to collect a few. These are very good questions, and you could just answer the easy ones. Don't worry about it.
Thank you again for your presentation. My name is Jesus. I'm with the Department of Homeland Security. And my question actually goes in line with what you just said, sir. So AMLO and his team a couple of weeks ago said that they wanted to keep the military and discarded the proposal of a National Guard because the state and local police forces could not assume the internal security roles that they currently have. And separately, the Secretary Designee for the Secretary of Public Security, Alfonso Durazo, said that he wants to reduce violence to OECD levels within 3 years and professionalize the police by increasing their the salary of like lower level employees and whatnot. And I know that you're not psychologists, but what makes you think, or I guess what makes you think is causing Durazo to think that professionalizing the police can be done if in the past it's been tried and it's failed? What makes you think that these proposals would, in a way, just make it seem as though he can dictate what can be done and it will get done? But it's not the way that many things work, of course, even here in the U.S. So I guess what makes you think that is causing Durazo to think in such a way?
Great, thank you. Sir, okay. Yes. Gentleman over there. And we'll end with you.
My question.
What's your name?
Sam Wyman from Jefferson Waterman. My question follows on from what everybody else has been saying, but López Obrador was elected with a landslide. Why? Does that landslide reflect any activity by the criminal organizations to manage a vote against the PRI or the PAN or this or that? And what can López Obrador do by virtue of the fact that he was elected in a landslide? Can he take this back to the people and say, you elected me. These are the problems. You are suffering from them. You have elected me to do something about them. So let's get together and do it. A simple question, perhaps, but to me it seems to be a very key point.
Sir, we'll give you the last word.
Hello, my name is Marcelo Guerra. I'm from Monterrey, Mexico, but I'm currently working here in DC with the Center for Hemispheric Defense Studies. And I was wondering, with all of your like academic, analytical, and field background, if you think it's feasible, given that Durazo said that that he would like to expand the public security budget by threefold, but they're not going to do that because they're going to focus on inequality and development. Do you think it's feasible to, like, all of the things that they want to do in terms of security, they're not going to increase their budget at all?
Thank you. Why don't we go back to those are great questions, and we'll have to do another session to get there. But why don't we maybe start with Maureen and then Falco, and then we'll give Ivan the last word.
Wow.
Some of these are much.
All right, lots of. I will not touch on all of them. In terms of the cabinet, AMLO, I think, in his interesting decision, nominated people for positions before he even was president. I mean, he made it very clear a long time ago who he wanted in different positions. I think from the point of view of those that are going to be charged with public security, as you mentioned, Durazo, or the Minister of the Interior, which is the former Supreme Court Judge Olga Sanchez Cordero, and then her advisors, which include Alejandro Encinas, who would be from our work in charge of human rights and migration issues. I think there are a lot of people that have well intentions and are thinking about these challenges. I think they're also slowly understanding how large the challenges are. I remember going back to when Calderon took office, and I think the thought that they didn't really grasp the magnitude of what was happening in the country until you're in office.
Yeah.
Perhaps now with this long transition team and the fact that they have been doing all these consultations throughout the country, they're probably getting a better sense before they take office of just how difficult this will be. But I think we'll see how they move forward. I think we do have some, I would say, cautiously optimistic views on where some of these areas will go when he assumes office, including the discussions that have been had about the Attorney General's office and the reforms. There's been lots of consultations with experts in civil society of where that needs to go. So I would say cautiously optimistic, but certainly lots of challenges. I think just in terms of policing, it is a huge endeavor. It's important to put some sort of exit strategy. I mean, I think that's what Durazo was trying to say, of we will remove the armed forces at a certain point from their public security tasks. And if you actually put a date to it, that would be helpful, because we haven't had that in 2 decades, and it's been, we're going to remove the armed forces and never a date. 3 years may be very ambitious, but I think it's important to start laying out, one, when that would happen, and also how. Clearly the resources is one of the biggest challenges, though, because it is, actually there has been a lot of investment in public security in Mexico. It has not necessarily gone to show fruition. So I think it's also pinpointing where are the gaps? And my argument would be a lot of it are in the accountability part of it, because if you continue to have police forces or military that can commit crimes internally or externally, or accept basic things like accepting bribes to torturing suspects to get a confession, you really need to focus on holding them accountable. I think it's one of the clearer ways to start producing different results. I would even say in a state like Tamaulipas, one of the failures of deploying the military, and the Marines have been there for quite some time, was that it was done without really focusing then on everything that needed to happen statewide to really improve their state police or municipal police. A lot of places don't have municipal police still. So how do you really, if you're going to deploy, again, the armed forces, how do you make sure that other part starts to happen? I think Ciudad Juárez may have some learning to show others, although they're also going through another wave of violence, but where they had a lot of investment through the Todos Somos Juárez program of how do you create the social, economic, society conditions in a city to address violence more comprehensively than just sending in the troops, for example. And I think in terms of the election results, you have had the difference to López Obrador's first 2 attempts to win office, that the support of a larger middle class that's just really sick of corruption. And I think that's probably what the tipping point was. It's the violence, and then for other population, it's the poverty, but there's a larger middle class that maybe didn't vote for him before that is just so tired of seeing so many corruption scandals at the federal level, siphoning out funds to several governors. I think it's, 14 past and current governors. So I think that was really what made this a different result and where the biggest challenge is. And going back to needing to solve some of these cases and show results within the next year, I think, of really going after some of these officials that have been accused of corruption.
Yeah, great. Well, that covers it all, right? So,
Sorry.
There's, about the cultural fight and then Coahuila in general, about narco culture. No science yet, hasn't been item of discussion so far. There's have been calls by civil society and other observers to take that into account, but we didn't see anything yet, as far as I'm conscious at least, from the new government to address that, which is, for a comprehensive package, it needs to be addressed, as I already mentioned before. I very much share that opinion, but it's not a priority for now, probably, from their perspective, as they're focused on what is perceived as hard security and on economic policy, essentially. As for how much he can do and why he thinks he can pull it off, I don't think he thinks necessarily he can pull it off as a political statement as well. I think it has to be read as such. He comes from a background of different affiliations, party political-wise. He's been, he's a political figure, and I would leave it at that probably. As I said, I think the promises are very, very, very ambitious. We will not see all of it resolved or even close to resolved. As Ivan already said, it's a titanic task, as cabinet members, future cabinet members will also tell you when you speak to them. They just ask you not to ever mention their name, basically. The hope from us is really that you might have sort of a process in which the incoming government will eventually, and hopefully sooner rather than later, dial down a little bit on the hopes, because as I said, hopes will turn to frustration, and frustration can then create a demand on a political market for much more radical and destructive forces than what we're currently seeing. So that would be the main worry. In that sense, we need to be realistic and call for a realistic approach to it all.
Ivan. Thank you very much. The lady at the back, you raise an absolutely crucial question. You can't just pull out the armed forces of a context like Tamaulipas, because yes, the narco-trafficking groups, the drug trafficking cartels, they are extremely powerful, extremely well-armed, and extremely violent. It is an active conflict. We speak of gradual withdrawal. That's obviously the objective, when possible, to replace with a proper civilian police force. Now, in a conflict, a traditional conflict, you would talk about perhaps confidence-building measures between the two sides. You would be speaking at this stage probably of peace negotiations or the possibility of such. Now, that is not possible in this context. So, it is an exploratory role, but the main point is you can't keep on increasing the state's response through firepower, because it is counterproductive in multiple ways, and the state itself is not an agent trying to enforce the law anymore in these contexts. So that is the reality. Yes, you're absolutely right, but that doesn't mean the response of more force and more power is actually going to get anywhere. Why is this time different? There's no evidence. We don't know. We simply can't be sure. Ideally, López Obrador would be a catalyst for a cohort of reformers with trust between them across the breadth of Mexico's institutions, not just the prosecution service and the police, but the judiciary, the prison service, many other aspects of what are failing institutions, all of whom are determined to bring about a change. And hopefully that would go actually hand in hand with a degree of exhaustion in Mexican society, and even within the criminal organizations, over the level of violence that they're responsible for. I hate using this example, but Colombia did see from 2000s onwards a series of processes going on at very different levels of society, at the municipal level, at the judicial level, of course at the level of security sector reform as well, in which everyone seemed to agree this violence cannot be sustained, it has to bring it down. Admittedly, Colombia had got to a level of violence considerably higher on a national scale than Mexico's is now. Mexico's can get worse. There is space for Mexico to get worse. And I think the last answer I would make to the gentleman over there, why was it a landslide? Well, I do remember very well what López Obrador said in 2006 when he led this long campaign to try and reverse the election result, which he said was rigged at the time. He gave a famous speech in the Zócalo saying to hell with the institutions. You know, these institutions are rigged, they're not reliable, and at that time it was, you know, people were disgusted with this comment. But the comment stood, and then 10, 12 years later, people actually agreed with him. To hell with the institutions. So that was probably a large part of the reasons that he achieved it. He had been in his position, acting with a degree of consistency over years that, you know, eventually his time came. I just want to throw one question back, however. I think it's fascinating that in this room in Washington, no one has asked about future U.S. collaboration with I mean, is it just like it's
that is a sign that this is a successful
so out of the question that, you know, I find it quite something.
I was going to attempt it, but I didn't want to ruin the discussion.
No, well, exactly. So I leave it.
Well, let me just say, on a final note, let me just say, it's raised by your mention of Colombia and also Marine's mention of when Calderon came in. We had the dialogue had a meeting a week after Peña Nieto came in.
Yes.
Mexico City. Yeah. And I'll never forget that meeting because we met with all the senior officials of the Peña Nieto government. And you'll remember that they were very determined to change the narrative after Calderon.
Yes.
And it was going to be a positive narrative, not a negative narrative. And so all of them talked about all of this stuff and not barely a word about security because they made every effort to try to not to sort of say, you know, because everything was so negative because of Calderon. And so we want to change that. And we had about 4 or 5 Colombians who were security experts who were at that meeting, and they were just astonished. Yes. And they just said, "You can't sweep it under the rug. We've learned that. You know, you got to face this head on. You got to face this with all the resources, the best people. Because if you pretend that it doesn't exist and just have this positive story, you can't sustain that. It's going to come back to bite you." And I think that's what happened with Peña Nieto. So that should be a cautionary tale for López Obrador. Anyway, Ivan and Falco, congratulations on a great report. Thank you so much, Marine. Brilliant comments. I really appreciate your participation. And to all of you, thanks for your great comments and questions. We'll be following this, and we'll see what happens after December 1st. Thank you all so much.
In 6 years.
And 6 years.